when Maddie invited me to do this, I was like, I thought that it might be useful if I shared some lessons from doing this work, because I've been at it for a while, and so that's the intention. What are some generous lessons that I can share via mistakes and all sorts of other things from embedding myself in this land for like over a decade now? I think it's really important to kind of honour the context of our conversations, and it feels like it's been such a week, hasn't it? Like, we started with like International Women's Day. We've had, she was just walking home on social media. There's a lot happening right now. So I think it's timely to have conversations like this. It's timely to come together in community. And I kind of just want to honour where we are at the moment. And I want to have quite a gentle conversation, but sometimes you can be gentle and kind of epic at the same time, and I feel it might verge on that. But I hope it's helpful. I hope it's useful. So let me start by sharing some lessons from the road that I've been on as a psychologist, as an activist, as the founder of the Consent Collective, where we go around to universities. We work a lot with our criminal justice system. We're in lots of different spaces. Like, we speak at music festivals, in Parliament. We do lectures. We've got a game show called How to Be Good in Bed. So we have a broad perspective on this stuff. So let me share some lessons from the road. Part of my context is I was a slow starter. I was late to arrive at this party, and I think one of the lessons for me in that is that it's really important to come with some compassion in terms of where everybody else is on their journey, and to recognise we are all creatures of our context, creatures of our experience. I was being educated at the time of John Major, Tony Blair, maybe it was the height of neoliberalism, I don't know, but I was not exposed to feminist thought, and I did not seek it either. I remember there was a gender module on my psychology degree when I took it, and I had no interest in doing it. And actually, I'm grateful, because most of the stuff I learned about gender in my education, it was just a variable to measure, along with ethnicity and age, just to check your data. I don't know that there was any kind of politics in that. But I feel sad. I feel sad I think, to give an example of the regret, is I didn't discover Audre Lorde until I was in my late 30s. And I'm sad for 19-year-old me, who was struggling with her identity, that could have done with some Audre Lorde. But, like everyone else, I was subject to an education system where there were hardly any females that I was exposed to, let alone black queer poets in the States. So for me, it is a regret that I didn't come to this party a little bit quicker. And I was actually working in this space before I really discovered the politics. And I think that's not good. I think you have to, if you're working in the sexual violence terrain, you have to be doing so with some political awareness. But it took me a while, and I'm conscious of that. I've been on a journey. And maybe that gives me a little bit of compassion for other people who have a journey to go on with this material. Another lesson from the road, a really important one actually, is that if you want to be part of change, if you want to be part of activism, if you are ambitious to be at the edge of the curve, breaking new ground, then you need some grounding. You need something that will give you firm roots when you feel vulnerable, when there is nobody to tell you that you're doing the right thing, because there is no path in front of you. And so it's essential that our work has got some kind of grounding, some kind of philosophy. And for me, that it needs to be a process. One of the things I'm concerned about is that I think we ask or focus too much on what is my feminist opinion about something, rather than what is my feminist process about something. And I feel like we need a movement that really centers process. That's what feminism is. It's a process. It's not an opinion. And I feel that lots of the times that we get stuck on issues, we're stuck in that opinion place instead of focusing on having a process that is embedded in feminist principles, so that it tells us what to do with power and leadership, and it tells us what to do when we have disruption and we have disagreement and we have differences. So having a process is really important, and we've already established that I didn't have one when I entered this space, or certainly not a feminist one, but I did have something, and I'm super grateful for it, so I'd like to share it with you. It was actually permaculture, which is this, I describe it as, it's like the philosophy of gardening. It's to do with the environment and our relationship with the environment. And I had a friend, I was working at the prison service at the time, because that's where I started my career. And I had a friend who was really into permaculture. Of course, she lived in Brighton. And so we would chat about it all the time. And I wasn't really interested in the environmental applications of it. But when we talked about it, I was like, this is so much bigger than just the environment. This is a philosophy. This is a process. And so some of the core principles that really spoke to me, and I think they explain a lot of how we do our work at the Consent Collective too, and why we're a little bit different, is because permaculture tells us to observe for a really long time. And you're looking for the patterns. Like a good gardener will watch their garden for at least a year before they do anything, because they're looking for the seasons and they're looking at how things are in relationship with everything else. And you need to look at the whole system, not just one thing. You need to step back and see those interrelationships and notice the small stuff and notice the big stuff, because when you're gardening, you're looking at the garden as a whole. Like the whole is bigger than just the sum of the parts. And so your observation needs to be with a wide lens, as well as zooming in and looking in closer detail. Something else that I really took, and it spoke to me instantly, was to value the margins and the edges. So if you have a boundary between two habitats, that boundary is very often an incredibly fertile place. There can be loads more life in a hedgerow, for example, which is a boundary between fields, than there is in the field itself. A margin is a fertile, diverse, interesting space. And so for me, this immediately spoke to me, because I considered myself on some margins, and I was aware that a lot of the people or spaces that I hung out in that were marginalized were the most interesting, the most ahead of the curve. The thinking was different. It was fertile terrain. And I just, I'm somebody that hangs out in diversity and inclusion kinds of spaces, and I just think this is a much more interesting way of framing that as an asset, as a wow, this is the place where things meet, and that makes it really interesting and valuable, rather than just how do we co-opt you into our way of doing things, which too many times it can be. Another thing from permaculture is to work with energy rather than against it, which is really wise. Is to look at where the energy, which direction does the energy want to go in, and how can you work with that. I think of Aikido when I'm thinking of this, like clever self-defense. Use the energy of the person who's coming towards you. Use their energy, but work with it and try to control the direction it's going in. And I think that's really interesting when we come to activism and when we come to protest. How can we work with energy rather than come up against something? Another principle is make the least change for the greatest gain. So a good gardener doesn't, there's gardening programs where they in a weekend, they blitz the place, bulldozer, JCB, and it looks nothing like it did. Again, not that kind of gardening. It's about making small, subtle, clever changes and then letting nature do its thing, working with nature. And I think there's something about Audre Lorde that I come back to so many times, like the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And I think one of the things I've realized is how much the master's tools are embedded into the way in which I think, what I think is a problem, how I think I should approach it, what I think a solution looks like. That's full of the master's tools. And so for me, this approach, this subtle work with the energy, is actually quite disruptive, even though it's gardening. And another disruptive thing is that problems are also solutions. In a garden, something that you chop down, you put it in the compost, it's next year's fertilizer. So how can we have this kind of recycling kind of idea when it comes to activism work? So this is something that's guided my thinking along the way, and it is something, if we start a new project, just check in, are we following those principles? This is the stuff for me when I'm not sure I'm doing it right. It gives me a little bit of grounding, along with a load of other stuff too. Okay, the story continues. Permaculture, I think, really helped me ease into this idea. Slow activism. Everybody, you enjoy a sigh of relief. I actually, when I meet people, it's very, very true that the things we care about are desperately important, that people are suffering today, that all of that is true. But the things that I dedicate my talent and career and time to, they're so huge, they're so big, they are going to take a long time to change. It's just a simple fact. And when I allow myself to think of things as more, maybe like much bigger than my lifetime, but I get to participate in that movement during my lifetime. Like, we do not need a 5-year plan for gender-based violence, but we need to consider how we, in our entire careers, can participate in a movement that we hope that future generations will continue with and realize. And so slow activism for me, it feels like you can do the really big stuff if you know you're going slow. Make it a 30-year plan, not a 5-year plan. Think about your whole life and what you would like to achieve, rather than just these little moments of time, which I'm sure are probably motivated by funding cycles or, parliamentary cycles. There's so many short-term cycles in society. But if you're here and you think you're here for the long haul, then give yourself the benefit of having that long haul vision and think in multiple decades, rather than just the time sequences that society gives us, which tend to be a lot shorter than that. I think a huge journey, and I guess partly it's from my own experience of arriving late. If my late arrival to this space was not met with compassion, because I didn't have the right language, and I would have made the rudimentary kind of hiccups, then that would have placed me in a box. It would have made it harder for me to participate in this space. I think it's essential that if we want to be part of a movement, that movement allows everybody to be on their journey, and it kind of honors that and it respects that. Doesn't mean we don't have to find ways in which we can be united, but I think it's really important that we don't look for consensus, and I would say especially consensus of opinions, because in the time that I've been doing this work, I think the one person I've probably disagreed with the most has been myself. I think differently, I'm growing, I'm learning, things are changing, especially if it's complex, something like gender. That's not just this simple no-brainer, that's something that I need to think about and learn and read. And so I think it's really important that we don't demand consensus of opinion in our spaces, and certainly not in our movement. I think if there is going to be a consensus, it needs to be around what kind of world are we trying to build? What's the goal? What are we for, rather than what are we against? And I think the consensus, maybe if it's anywhere, it's in process. It's a process that says that, well, we need to focus on community, we need to build safe spaces, we need to have a process that includes everybody. Those things feel to me much more important than, I have a different opinion than you on whatever the hot topic is at the moment. I can work with people who have a different opinion with me. I struggle to work with people who have a very different process to me. That feels a lot less safe. And so I guess the invitation for those of us who want to do work in this space is to really think about how do we balance that piece between, you absolutely have to be on the same page as me in order to do this project, or to be in this particular space because it's important. Like, this is within our movement. This is a space for people who particularly do agree on this area. But there is still space for you in this wider movement. It's okay that you are where you are, and that's all right. So how do we navigate that boundary and that power dynamic? But I think this is one of the reasons why, like I think the GRA has been very divisive, and I feel like if we could try to have a movement that is not about everybody having the same opinion and demanding consensus, then I think we would be a damn sight stronger, and I would be learning more, which would be good. It would be more fertile. Okay, this one's been really useful, and I know I started with gardening, but another big influence on how I think has been quantum physics, which I'm not going to get into. But one of the gifts of quantum physics has been to really recognize that wisdom isn't about having the right answers. Wisdom is about asking better and better and better questions and being on like this better questions hunt. And you don't even need to answer the questions, but the questions that we ask are incredibly important because they speak to our focus. For those of you that either are therapists or you've been in therapy, I don't know if this resonates with you, but sometimes like the questions that we ask, it says so much. It says more than the answers that we give. And so I think it's really important, and I find it really important that we focus on what questions are we asking and are they the best questions to be asking. So at the moment, literally this weekend, whilst there's lots of stuff on social media, it feels like there's lots of conversations happening. And I guess for me, it's like, what are the right questions to be asking now? Or the most useful questions, the questions that are of service to the world that we would like to build together, the world that we'd like to participate in. And one of the questions that is one that has really resonated with me recently, and it might not resonate with you. Remember earlier that I said we can all be in our different place, and it's fine if we're in different places. But a question that's been on my mind is, when we do activism, whose power are we reinforcing? And there's something in there that's really important for me to consider. So I'm just going to talk about this in terms of me. I'm not telling you that you need to think like this. But for a lot of my career, I've worked alongside our criminal justice system, and a lot of the questions I was asking was about our existing criminal justice system. And a lot of the changes that I was hoping to achieve was about our criminal justice system. But when I step back and ask myself, well, when that is how I define my activism, when what I'm saying is this government must do better, this Crown Prosecution Service must do better, this university must do better, this employer must do better, I'm actually reinforcing the power of all of those institutions I've just named, because I'm saying they hold the power to change this. And when I do that, I'm placing a lot of power in their hands. And one of the things I've noticed in terms of my own work is if I focus all of my activism on legislation, new laws, criminal justice system, I'm just reinforcing the idea that this is for them, this is theirs, this is where they have the power. And I'm not saying that they don't have any power, but I'm just saying, what are the questions I'm not asking? What are the spaces I'm not building? What are the alternatives to justice that I'm not dedicating myself to? What are the personal responsibilities that I have that I'm absolving myself of by saying that this is a failure of some institution? And it's a really hard question to kind of, dig into, but this is where I find myself with my own activism work, having focused a lot on effectively the system. These days, none of my work that is about the system is my activism work. I'm still very happy to work with police forces and judges and the Crown Prosecution Service. But for me, I frame that very differently now. That is not how I'm making change. I feel like if I do a good job working with police officers, and if somebody chooses to report and they get a better experience because of something that I've contributed to, then that will contribute to their well-being and their healing. And that is why I'm in that space. And I will also be in those spaces because the professionals who work in those spaces, a lot of them really do care, and I'm not going to give up on those people. But in terms of being an activism and trying to achieve change and trying to achieve a better world, my job is to build alternatives to justice. My job is to build spaces where we can talk about justice in terms of our health and our income and being a parent and all of these other things that actually we do have a lot more power over than this other thing, this justice system that we do not have control of. So that's a important, but I recognise it can be a really difficult question to ask because we've been trained to assume that the state is what it's all about, the man. And I guess when we do our activism, to what extent are we reinforcing that that is the truth? And what alternative kinds of activism could we be doing if we ask different questions? That's all. And in terms of where I'm at now, very much, my most recent work I've really got into healing a lot more. My work has always, if you've read The Courage to Be Me, you know that helping people living with trauma has been a big part of what I'm interested in. But I think one of the things that's really happened for me recently has been a really clear link between healing and activism and feminism. Like those three words, the reason why they're all together in the title is I can no longer separate them. I mean all of them when I say one of them, because it is a political act to heal yourself. It is deeply political, and it's deeply healing to be part of activism. And I would actually say I would go further with it as well. I think in order to be safe as an activist for yourself and for others, there's a requirement for you to do some healing work there too. So it's like this goes in both directions. And so for me, I think it's really important that we recognise that it's not just that our traumas are political, our healing is political. It's deeply political that there's a 1-year waiting list for therapy for gender-based violence. It's deeply political that we don't have the kinds of communities readily available in relationships, like that these relationships have been professionalised, that you need to pay someone. And so like this, our healing process is massively political. And for me, it's completely embedded in our activism work too. I think if we want to talk about how do we create a world where this doesn't happen, then healing is a massive part of that conversation. We need to have conversations about why is it that people feel so lacking in power, that they exert it on people who are smaller than them, people who are weaker than them. Why are people acting out in this way? I think there's a huge healing conversation to be had if we want to prevent these kinds of things from happening in the first place. And also, I think atonement is a really important part of activism work. It's been an important part of my journey too. And when I say atonement, I mean at-one-ment. It's about being whole. And it's about especially that shadow side where you recognise that, yes, you are here to do good, and that's wonderful, and you probably will do some good. But you will also have the capacity to cause harm. And I'm kind of being generous when I say capacity to cause harm. Like we are all also perpetrating harm as well as being on the receiving end of harm for all sorts of reasons because of the systems and the structures that we're very aware of. So to give you an example, as a white person, it's not good enough for me to say, oh, I don't intentionally say anything racist. Like we know that's the kind of stuff that's happening on social media right now. We know that's not enough. I need to be actively engaged in anti-racism work. I need to be actively safe for people of colour. And I need to be able to atone for the fact that, to be able to hold the fact that I am very capable of causing harm with or without consciousness. And, to do activism work is to seek power. And it's like, how how are we going to hold that power as activists around the spaces we create, around the opportunities we get? And so healing is massively political for me. And one of the things I've just launched this week, it's been a labour of love for about 6-7 months. In a way, it's been, I guess lots of us have had our lives go in different directions because of lockdown. And this is something I wouldn't have created at this time in quite this way if it hadn't been for lockdown. And I'm really grateful for it. So How Do People Heal from Trauma is the sequel to my book, The Courage to Be Me, but it's not a book. It's an online course, but we're setting up it's like a pre-recorded 2-day learning retreat. So it's a way of gifting yourself some time and space. And for me, that is a political act, it's a healing act, it's a everything act. But I think really helping each other heal, healing in community, is such an important part of being a feminist. I think it's a central part. I think we need to heal from the things we know about the world. We need to be healed in order to be safe for others. And so for me, that's been like a massive part of my personal ride